Native American dish, stolen by colonists, sold back to the world by a ketchup company. You've heard that version. Maybe you've repeated that version, feeling pretty smug about it. Welcome all my viewers in Dish Diaries. Today I bring for you the history of baked beans. Sit back and relax and watch it. Stay with me.
Welcome to Dish Diaries.
Here's the problem. That correction is only half right, and the half that's wrong is hiding something worse than the myth it replaced. Because underneath the sweet, sticky sauce in every can of baked beans sitting in your pantry right now is a second erasure. One that has nothing to do with pilgrims and everything to do with a trade route soaked in human suffering. Nobody puts that on the label. Let's start with the easy version, the one you probably already believe. H.J. Heinz did not invent baked beans. That much is true. Heinz started canning them in 1895 in a plant in Pittsburgh, and by the early 1900s, he'd shipped them across the Atlantic and turned them into a British breakfast staple. But Heinz was a packager, not an inventor. He took a dish that was already centuries old and put it in a tin. So far, that's the story you know. Colonial dish, corporate theft, case closed. Except, whose dish was it before the colonists touched it? That's where the story most people tell starts getting shaky. Because the popular answer, Native Americans invented baked beans, is doing a lot of quiet work to hide something else. It's true, but it's also incomplete in a way that erases a different set of people entirely. And that gap? That's where this video actually starts. Here's the version that gets repeated in food blogs and documentaries. Indigenous peoples of the Northeast, the Wampanoag, the Narragansett, the Penobscot, taught colonists to slow-cook beans with maple syrup in earthen pots, sometimes with venison or bear fat. Colonists swapped in molasses, Boston got its nickname. The end. It's a tidy story. Too tidy. Food historian Keith Stavely, who spent years digging through early American cookbooks, found something uncomfortable. There's no solid documentary evidence that the sweetened, sauced baked bean, the dish you'd actually recognize on a plate, existed before the Victorian era, not the 1600s, the 1800s. So who wrote the Pilgrim and Friendly Native version into the record? Cookbook authors and food writers generations later, constructing a folksy national origin story for a country that wanted one. That doesn't mean indigenous cooking had nothing to do with baked beans. It almost certainly did. The beans themselves, the slow earth oven method, the pairing of legumes with fat and sweetness, all trace to indigenous foodways of the Northeast. What Stavely's research shows is narrower and honestly more damning. The specific romantic image, kindly natives handing colonists a recipe by the fire, was manufactured 2 centuries after the fact to make a settler dish feel folkloric. The technique was real. The Fireside Handshake was fiction. So, if the campfire story is invented, what actually happened? Long before any European ship reached the northeast coast, Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, communities were already slow-cooking native bean varieties in covered earthen pits, sometimes for a full day, using maple sap as a sweetener centuries before cane sugar or molasses ever crossed the Atlantic. This wasn't a primitive precursor to the real dish. It was a sophisticated food preservation technology built around the Three Sisters agricultural system: corn, beans, and squash grown together, a method that took generations of botanical knowledge to perfect. Colonists adapted the technique. They didn't refine it into something new. They substituted ingredients: salt pork instead of venison, eventually molasses instead of maple. Notice what happened to the credit along the way. The cooking method, the actual hard-won knowledge, came from indigenous communities. The final commercial product carries a Pittsburgh businessman's name on the label and a pilgrim-adjacent origin story in the folklore. That's erasure with a paper trail, and it's about to get worse. Here's the part almost nobody puts in the baked bean explainer video. When colonists swapped maple syrup for molasses, they weren't just picking a cheaper sweetener. They were plugging New England into one of the most brutal supply chains in human history.
Molasses arriving in Boston Harbor in the 1600s and 1700s didn't come from a farm down the road. It came from Caribbean sugar plantations in Barbados, in Jamaica, worked by enslaved Africans under conditions so lethal that plantation owners often calculated it was cheaper to work someone to death and replace them than to keep them alive long term. That molasses fed New England's rum distilleries. That rum, in turn, was shipped to West Africa and traded for enslaved people, who were transported to the Caribbean to grow more sugar, to make more molasses, to ship north again. Historians call this the triangular trade. It's not a metaphor, it's a closed loop, and Boston sat at one corner of it. So when your great-great-grandmother's Boston baked beans recipe calls for molasses for that authentic New England flavor, that sweetness has a supply chain, and the supply chain runs through a slave ship. This is not a coincidence buried in the ingredients, it's the ingredient. Fast forward to 1895, Heinz canning operation opens in Pittsburgh. Within a decade, Heinz baked beans are a fixture on British breakfast tables, marketed with cheerful branding and zero mention of where any of this actually came from. Not the Wampanoag and Narragansett cooking knowledge underneath the recipe, not the molasses trade that shaped its signature flavor, just a red and white label and a promise of comfort food. That's the final move in this story, and it's the quietest one. Commercialization doesn't just profit from erasure, it seals it. Once a dish is canned, branded, and sold at scale, the story that ships with it becomes the only story most people ever hear. Nobody eating beans on toast in Manchester in 1920 was thinking about Narragansett earth ovens or Barbadian sugar plantations. They were thinking about breakfast. That's still true today. The can survived, the context didn't. So let's go back to where we started. You thought you already knew this one. Native dish, stolen by colonists, sold back by a ketchup company. That version made you feel like you'd seen through something. But the real story isn't a single theft, it's two erasures stacked on top of each other. One that buried indigenous culinary knowledge under a pilgrim campfire myth invented 2 centuries later, and one that hid an entire slave trade inside a sweetener nobody thinks twice about. The can never lied to you, it just never told you enough to ask the question. So here's the question next time you open one. What's actually in the sauce? See you in the next video. Till then, bye.